The American major found them at a petrol station 11 kilometers outside the exercise boundary, drinking coffee from paper cups and reading a German newspaper. His first thought was that they had surrendered or been captured. His second thought, which arrived approximately 4 seconds later, was that these were the same men who had just invalidated 9 months of operational planning by assassinating a notional 3-star general with a weapon that exercise rules did not acknowledge existed. They offered him coffee. He declined. He later wrote in his journal that he did not know whether to arrest them or ask them how they did it. Exercise. Northern Guardian was designed to test NATO's northern flank defenses against a Soviet-style conventional assault. The year was 1997. The Soviet Union had been dead for 6 years, but the scenarios persisted, as military scenarios do, because the infrastructure for them already existed, and because generals who had spent careers preparing for one war found it difficult to imagine another. The exercise parameters filled a binder 4 centimeters thick. Rules of engagement, designated combat zones, observation protocols, safe areas where headquarters elements could operate without threat of direct action. The 22nd Special Air Service Regiment received the same binder as every other participating unit. They read it completely. They then spent 3 weeks identifying every assumption embedded in its pages. The command post they targeted sat inside a zone marked administrative, no combat operations. The 3-star general they killed had positioned himself there precisely because the rules guaranteed his safety. He was eating breakfast when a referee informed him he was dead. The SAS team had entered the zone dressed as forestry workers, using a vehicle they had purchased from a timber company for cash 2 days prior. The formal complaint reached Shape headquarters within 72 hours. Lieutenant General Harold Reeves, the American officer who filed it, described the British actions as fundamentally incompatible with exercise objectives. The British liaison officer who received the complaint was a colonel named Davies. His written response was 11 words. We were tasked to disrupt command capability. Command capability was disrupted. The word appeared 17 times in the consolidated American after-action report. Cheating. It was underlined in 3 instances and capitalized in 2. The accusations were specific and numerous, compiled by staff officers who had spent months designing an exercise they believed would test NATO interoperability under realistic conditions. The SAS had violated the following protocols: unauthorized acquisition of civilian vehicles, failure to observe designated safe zones, impersonation of non-combatant personnel, operation outside established exercise boundaries, and what one American planner described as a systematic disregard for the referee system that renders structured evaluation meaningless. The civilian vehicles were perhaps the most contentious point. Exercise rules permitted military transport only. The SAS acquired a postal van in the first 12 hours, then supplemented it with a fishing trawler and 2 private automobiles. The trawler cost 600 Deutsche Marks. The seller, a retired fisherman from Tromsø, later told a Norwegian journalist he had assumed they were film location scouts. The safe zones existed because exercises require administrative space. Communications equipment must be maintained. Officers must sleep. Medical personnel must operate without the complication of simulated combat. The SAS treated these zones as they would treat any defended position in actual war, as obstacles to be circumvented, not boundaries to be respected. When challenged, the British commanding officer, a major whose name remains classified in official records, presented his interpretation calmly. The enemy, he noted, would not observe safe zones. The enemy would not restrict himself to military vehicles. The enemy would not politely avoid headquarters areas because a planning document designated them off-limits. If NATO wished to test its defenses, NATO should test them against opponents who behaved as opponents actually behave. The American response was that exercises have rules because exercises are not wars. The British response, delivered without apparent irony, was that this seemed rather the point. The philosophical disagreement exposed at Northern Guardian did not originate in 1997. It originated in 1948. In a British colony most of the American officers had never studied. Fighting an enemy that existed in no Pentagon war game scenario, the Malayan emergency was not classified as a war because insurance companies would not cover losses in a war zone. It was instead an emergency, which satisfied Lloyd's of London while killing 11,048 people over 12 years. The enemy were communist insurgents, ethnic Chinese guerrillas who operated from jungle bases and followed no doctrine recognizable to conventional military planners. The SAS was reconstituted specifically for this campaign. The regiment had been disbanded after World War II, its desert warfare expertise deemed obsolete. Malaya proved the disbandment premature. Colonel Mike Calvert, a Chindit veteran who had fought the Japanese in Burma, proposed a new unit trained specifically for deep jungle penetration. The War Office approved the proposal in 1950. What Calvert's men learned in Malaya became the doctrinal foundation for everything that followed. The insurgents did not wear uniforms. They did not mass for battle. They did not respect boundaries between military and civilian space because such boundaries did not exist in the jungle. They struck, vanished, and reappeared somewhere the British had designated safe. The SAS adapted by abandoning conventional tactical assumptions entirely. Patrols operated for weeks without resupply. Operators learned local languages, not from phrase books, but from months of immersion with Aboriginal tribes. The regiment developed what Calvert called the doctrine of the grueling, the belief that victory belonged to whoever could endure longer, move quieter, and think less rigidly. One patrol commander, Captain John Woodhouse, summarized the lesson in a training document that remained classified until 1989. The enemy does not read our manuals. We should not expect him to follow them. The man who reads the manual and follows it will pass most military selection courses. He will not pass SAS selection. This is by design. The selection process operates from the regimental depot at Hereford and has remained fundamentally unchanged since 1953, when Woodhouse, by then a major, codified the methodology he had developed in Malaya. The course runs approximately 5 months. The failure rate exceeds 90%. The physical requirements are published. The psychological requirements are not. The physical component is brutal by any objective measure. Candidates carry Bergens weighing between 25 and 35 kilograms across the Brecon beacons in Wales, covering distances that increase daily while time limits decrease. The final march, known as Endurance, covers 64 kilometers with a 30-kilogram Bergen plus weapon and equipment. The time limit is 20 hours. The terrain includes fan dance, a mountain whose name has become synonymous with the course itself. But the physical suffering is not the point. The physical suffering is the medium through which psychological suitability is assessed. Instructors observe candidates under conditions of extreme fatigue, sleep deprivation measured in days rather than hours, and deliberate uncertainty. Orders change without explanation. Objectives shift mid-march. Candidates who ask why receive no answer. Candidates who require answers to function do not pass. A former directing staff member, speaking to a regimental historian in 2003, described the selection philosophy in terms that illuminate Northern Guardian. We are looking for men who solve problems, not men who wait for permission to solve problems. If you need someone to tell you what to do, you will not survive the work we do, and you certainly will not pass this course. The contradictory orders are intentional. Candidates receive instructions that cannot be reconciled. The correct response is to make a decision and execute it, accepting that no option is fully correct. The incorrect response is to seek clarification. The campaign in Dhofar province, Oman, between 1970 and 1976 does not appear in most histories of Cold War conflict. The British government preferred it that way. Parliament had not authorized the deployment. The public had not been informed. The SAS operated under cover of secondment to the Sultan's armed forces, a legal fiction that permitted deniability. The enemy were Marxist insurgents supported by South Yemen, itself supported by the Soviet Union. The terrain was mountainous, arid, and populated by tribal groups whose loyalties were fluid and whose cooperation could not be assumed. The Sultan's conventional forces had failed to suppress the rebellion through military action. The SAS proposed an alternative. The doctrine that emerged, known internally as hearts and minds, inverted conventional counterinsurgency logic. Rather than treating the population as a potential threat to be controlled, the SAS treated them as a potential ally to be cultivated. Medical teams operated in villages where no government presence had existed. Veterinary assistance was provided for livestock. Wells were drilled, schools were built. The operators who delivered these services lived among the population for months, learning dialects, attending tribal councils, and developing intelligence networks that no external force could replicate. A sergeant who served 3 tours in Dhofar, interviewed for an internal regimental history in 1982, described the methodology. You cannot bomb a population into supporting you. You cannot threaten them into loyalty. You earn it or you do not have it. And earning it takes time that headquarters never wants to give you. The campaign succeeded. The insurgency was defeated by 1976. The methodology was studied, admired, and largely ignored by American planners who found it unmeasurable by the metrics their systems required. Hearts and minds produced no body counts, no terrain captured, no objectives achieved on a timeline. It produced only a stable province and a defeated enemy. The Pentagon reviewed the Dhofar reports in 1978. The assessment concluded that the British approach relies heavily on non-quantifiable factors and extended timelines incompatible with American force projection doctrine. The night of May 27, 1982, 4 men from D Squadron lay in the wet grass 400 meters from Argentine positions at Goose Green, counting. They had been there for 19 hours. The temperature hovered at 2 degrees Celsius. Rain fell horizontally across the East Falkland landscape. Driven by winds exceeding 40 knots, they did not move. They counted. The official intelligence estimate provided to Lieutenant Colonel H. Jones and 2 para stated that Goose Green was defended by a reinforced company, perhaps 500 Argentine troops at the outside. The 4 SAS operators watching through night observation devices reached a different number. Sergeant Major Lawrence Gallagher, who led the reconnaissance patrol, would later state in testimony to the Campaign Review Board that his team identified a minimum of 200 Argentine personnel in and around the Goose Green-Darwin Isthmus. They observed not 1, but 3 artillery positions. They documented interlocking fields of fire from at least 12 machine gun emplacements. They noted the presence of anti-aircraft weapons repositioned for ground defense. The intelligence was relayed to Brigade Headquarters. Brigade Headquarters did not amend the attack plan. What happened next has been analyzed in every staff college in the Western world. 2 para advanced into prepared positions held by more than twice the estimated enemy strength. Colonel H. Jones was killed leading a charge against a machine gun nest that the intelligence estimate said should not have existed. 17 British soldiers died. 35 were wounded. The battle lasted 15 hours instead of the projected 6. The SAS reconnaissance team watched from the high ground as the attack unfolded below them. Gallagher would later tell author Mark Urban that the most difficult moment of his career was not the 19 hours lying in freezing mud. It was listening to the radio traffic as men died attacking positions his team had reported and his superiors had dismissed. The count was correct. The plan proceeded anyway. In March 1983, a memorandum circulated within the Joint Chiefs of Staff that would not be declassified for 23 years. Its subject line read, "Participation parameters for Allied Special Operations Forces in Reforger and related exercises." The document, obtained by researcher Dr. Thomas Henriksen of the Hoover Institution, contained language that military historians still quote with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Colonel Franklin Morrison, who served as exercise director for Reforger 7, provided testimony included in the memorandum's appendix. His assessment was direct. British SAS elements consistently terminated training scenarios before evaluation metrics could be established. Their methods, while tactically effective, destroyed the training value for participating American units who were unable to observe proper phase lines and checkpoint protocols. A second statement, attributed to a major from the 82nd Airborne, whose name remains redacted, complained that SAS operators refused to acknowledge simulated kills when they deemed the engagement unrealistic, yet inflicted simulated casualties on our forces using methods not covered by exercise rules. The memorandum recommended that SAS participation in certain NATO exercises be limited to observer or advisory roles, unless specific protocols were established in advance. Lieutenant General William Gruber, speaking at the Army War College in 1997, provided context that the original document lacked. The British, he explained, approached exercises as rehearsals for actual operations. American doctrine treated exercises as opportunities to test specific systems and validate procurement decisions. When an SAS team disabled an entire communications battalion using 4 men and 40 minutes, it answered a question no one at the Pentagon had authorized anyone to ask. The ban was never formally announced. It simply appeared in the planning documents for subsequent exercises, a quiet acknowledgement that certain allies were too effective to train against. On January 22, 1991, 8 men from B Squadron, 22 SAS, crossed the Iraqi border on foot, carrying equipment that weighed between 95 and 110 kilograms per man. Their mission designation was Bravo 20. Their objective was the identification and destruction of mobile Scud missile launchers operating in the northwestern Iraqi desert, specifically the sector from which missiles were being fired at Israel. The strategic logic was clear. If Israel entered the war in retaliation, the coalition would fracture. Arab nations would not fight alongside Jerusalem. The patrol commander was Sergeant Andy McNabb. His second-in-command was Sergeant Vince Phillips. The remaining 6 operators included Corporal Chris Ryan, who would walk further than any other man in the patrol, and Trooper Robert Consiglio, who would not walk out at all. The intelligence package they received stated that the operational area was flat, hard desert with minimal civilian presence. The actual terrain was undulating scrub land dotted with Bedouin settlements and agricultural outposts. The intelligence package stated temperatures would be manageable. The actual temperature on their first night dropped to -14 degrees Celsius. But the most consequential failure was not meteorological. The most consequential failure was technical. The patrol carried American-issued TAC-B emergency beacons. They carried British PRC 319 high-frequency radios. They carried enough firepower to engage a company-sized element. They carried food for 14 days and water for 5. What they did not carry, what they could not carry because the equipment had not been provided correctly, was a functioning link to anyone who could help them. Within 72 hours, the most famous Special Operations Patrol in British history would be scattered across the Iraqi desert, hunted by an enemy they were supposed to be hunting. The TAC-B beacon issued to Bravo 20 operated on a frequency incompatible with the aircraft assigned to their support corridor. This is not interpretation. This is the finding of the subsequent internal review conducted by the Directorate of Special Forces, portions of which were disclosed during parliamentary inquiry in 1996. The PRC 319 radio sets carried by the patrol had not received the correct cryptographic fills before insertion. The fills, the coded settings that allow encrypted communication with friendly stations, were either corrupted or mismatched. The patrol discovered this when Sergeant McNabb attempted to establish contact with the forward operating base on their first night in Iraq. The radio worked. The radio could transmit and receive. The radio simply could not communicate with anyone capable of providing fire support, extraction, or intelligence updates. The patrol was equipped with technology worth approximately £340,000. That technology was functionally equivalent to silence. What remained were options that would have been familiar to operators in 1941. They could walk, they could hide, they could fight with the weapons in their hands, they could navigate by compass and star, they could read terrain and estimate distance by pace count. The American doctrine of the period emphasized networked warfare, the integration of platforms through real-time data links, the concept later formalized as the revolution in military affairs. Bravo 20 was inserted into Iraq carrying that doctrine's physical manifestation. When that manifestation failed, the patrol reverted to something older. Chris Ryan would later write that the realization of their isolation arrived not as panic, but as a kind of clarity. The technology had promised much. The desert did not care what technology had promised. The desert was cold and large and filled with people who wanted to kill them. Navigation became arithmetic. Degrees on a compass, meters per minute, hours until dawn. Corporal Chris Ryan walked 187 kilometers in 7 nights, alone, carrying a rifle and minimal water, through terrain actively patrolled by Iraqi forces. The human body at rest in temperate conditions requires approximately 2.5 liters of water per day to maintain basic function. A body engaged in sustained physical exertion in cold conditions requires between 4 and 6 liters. Ryan consumed approximately 3 liters total over the course of his evasion. The ambient temperature during his movement ranged from -4 degrees Celsius at night to 12 degrees during the brief daylight hours when he remained hidden. He had no shelter beyond what his clothing provided. His boots had not been designed for the terrain. By the 3rd night, his feet had begun to deteriorate. Sergeant Vince Phillips did not survive the cold. Phillips separated from the main group during the initial chaos following their compromise. He moved west toward the Syrian border, the same direction Ryan would eventually travel. On the 2nd night, Phillips's body temperature dropped below the threshold at which the human nervous system can maintain consciousness. He was found by Bedouins, who reported his location to Iraqi authorities. He had been dead for approximately 6 hours. Trooper Robert Consiglio was killed in a firefight near the Euphrates River, covering the attempted escape of 2 other patrol members. He engaged Iraqi pursuers with a .203 grenade launcher until his ammunition was exhausted. The citation for his posthumous military medal describes his actions as selfless. The citation does not describe the specific circumstances. Consiglio was already suffering from advanced hypothermia when he chose to stay behind. 3 men died. 4 were captured. 1 walked out. The walk that Chris Ryan completed has been studied at the Hereford training facility ever since. The distance was not remarkable for an SAS operator. The conditions were. The book sold 4 million copies. The classified debrief ran to 47 pages. They described different wars. Sergeant Andy McNabb returned from captivity in March 1991, having spent 6 weeks in Iraqi interrogation facilities after the Bravo 20 patrol's catastrophic compromise. The public account, published in 1993, focused on escape, evasion, and individual heroism under torture. The official after-action report, submitted to 22 SAS headquarters in Hereford and subsequently briefed to American liaison officers at JSOC, addressed systemic failures that implicated both armies. The specific criticisms were uncomfortable. McNabb's debrief noted that the patrol's communications equipment had been issued without complete frequency lists for American aircraft operating in the area. This omission meant that when the patrol's primary PRC-319 radio failed due to battery drain in sub-zero temperatures, backup communication through American airborne assets became impossible. The report documented that requests for extraction support, transmitted during the first 12 hours after compromise, received no response from coalition air controllers who had not been briefed on the patrol's existence or communication protocols. A former signals officer at Hereford, speaking decades later to military historians, confirmed what the public never learned. The patrol's emergency beacon frequencies had not been properly coordinated with American AWACS aircraft. When McNabb's men were running for the Syrian border with Iraqi hunter-killer teams in pursuit, coalition aircraft passed overhead repeatedly without receiving their transmissions. The debrief recommended 17 specific changes to coalition communication procedures. 14 were adopted by British Special Operations. The American liaison officer present at the Hereford briefing was instructed to summarize the findings for JSOC leadership. His summary ran to 3 pages and omitted all references to American communication failures. The phrase that survived into official channels was "equipment malfunction compounded by extreme weather conditions." The phrase that did not survive was "systematic interoperability failure between coalition special operations elements." Before the doctrine had a name, it had a body count. Specifically, 12 hostages killed during 3 American-advised rescue attempts in Colombia between 1994 and 1997, operations that followed conventional special operations protocols developed for short-duration military scenarios and applied them to prolonged cartel kidnappings with predictable results. The SAS had been advising Colombian special police units since 1989, initially through unofficial channels that allowed deniability, later through formal Ministry of Defense attachments that satisfied legal requirements without satisfying American sensibilities. The British approach to counter-kidnapping differed from American doctrine in a fundamental assumption. American protocols prioritized speed and overwhelming force, reasoning that hostage survival depended on preventing captors from executing contingency plans. The SAS approach prioritized intelligence development and captor psychology, reasoning that rushing an assault against captors who had held hostages for weeks or months simply accelerated the execution timeline. The specific protocol that American DEA advisors initially rejected involved deliberate delay. SAS instructors taught Colombian units to extend negotiation phases beyond conventional timelines, using the additional weeks to develop informant networks within cartel security structures. A former SAS advisor, speaking to researchers at King's College London in 2008, explained the logic with characteristic understatement. The longer they hold someone, the more people know where that person is being held. Every guard goes home eventually. Every guard has a wife who talks to neighbors. In 1998, after the third failed conventional rescue resulted in the execution of a captured petroleum executive during the assault itself, DEA leadership requested access to British counter-kidnapping training materials. The request was granted. Within 18 months, American advisory programs in Colombia had adopted the extended intelligence development phase, the captor psychology assessment protocols, and the informant cultivation timeline. The SAS instructors who had been dismissed as too passive in 1995 were invited back in 1999 to train the same units that had been told to ignore them. Operation Barras began at 06:16 local time on September 10, 2000, when 3 Chinook helicopters carrying D Squadron 22 SAS crossed the final checkpoint 7 kilometers from the West Side Boys camp at Geberi Bana. The assault lasted 17 minutes. The operational specificity of what occurred during those 17 minutes remains instructive. The West Side Boys numbered approximately 150 fighters, a Sierra Leonean militia that had captured 11 British soldiers from the Royal Irish Regiment during a patrol 12 days earlier. Negotiations had secured the release of 5 hostages. The remaining 6 were scheduled for execution if British forces did not withdraw from Sierra Leone entirely. The SAS operational plan called for simultaneous assaults on 2 locations, the main camp at Geberi Bana, where the hostages were held, and a secondary position at Magbeni across the Rokel Creek, where militia reinforcements were concentrated. Approximately 200 rounds were expended by British forces during the assault. West Side Boys casualties numbered between 25 and 30 killed, with an additional 18 captured. British casualties totaled 1 killed and 12 wounded, including Major Matthew Lowe of D Squadron. Major Lowe was shot through the lower leg during the initial approach to the hostage building. The round shattered his fibula. He continued forward. The Military Cross citation describes his actions in language that military historians recognize as deliberate understatement. He continued to direct his men's fire while organizing the extraction of hostages despite his wound. What the citation does not specify is that the wound was arterial, that he applied his own tourniquet while still issuing commands, and that he refused morphine until all 6 hostages had been loaded onto the evacuation helicopter. All 6 hostages survived. The 17-minute duration was not accidental, it was trained. The billion-dollar architecture produced imagery. The 4-man patrols produced intelligence. American commanders understood the distinction by 2004, though admitting it required a vocabulary their procurement systems did not reward. In southern Afghanistan between 2002 and 2008, the American intelligence apparatus deployed an unprecedented surveillance constellation. KH-11 satellites provided 10-centimeter resolution imagery. Predator and Reaper drones maintained 24-hour coverage of designated areas of interest. Signals intelligence platforms intercepted communications across a spectrum that would have seemed science fiction to analysts a decade earlier. The daily intelligence summary distributed to coalition commanders ran to several hundred pages, cross-referenced and keyword searchable. The SAS maintained 4-man observation posts in the same areas, men carrying 50-kilogram rucksacks who lay motionless for days at a time watching compounds that satellites had already photographed from every angle. What these men produced could not be photographed from orbit. They reported which vehicles arrived at night and departed before dawn. They noted which compounds received visitors who were greeted with particular deference. They observed the age and physical condition of men who moved between locations, distinguishing between fighters and facilitators by posture, by gait, by the weight of what they carried. A senior American intelligence officer speaking to researchers at the Naval Postgraduate School in 2011 used a phrase that appeared in several classified assessments before being sanitized for public consumption. The embarrassing human advantage, he called it. The satellites told us what was there. The British told us what it meant. The disparity was quantified in internal reviews. SAS developed intelligence packets led to successful targeting operations at a rate 34% higher than imagery-derived intelligence alone. The 4-man patrols, costing thousands of dollars per deployment, consistently outperformed systems costing billions. The paradox was not technological, it was philosophical. The doctrinal revisions began arriving at American Special Operations training facilities in 2011. They carried bureaucratic nomenclature designed to obscure their origin. The debt was obvious to anyone who had served alongside British operators in the preceding decade. The specific changes were documented in training circulars that circulated through JSOC and eventually filtered to conventional Special Forces units. Load carriage protocols were revised downward, with recommended rucksack weights for extended reconnaissance operations reduced from American standards to figures that closely matched SAS guidelines. The emphasis on foot mobility over vehicular insertion increased in curriculum hours. Extended observation post procedures, previously dismissed as unnecessarily passive, became mandatory training evolutions. More significant than equipment or techniques was a philosophical shift that former JSOC personnel have described in terms that echo British methodology from decades earlier. The 2012 revision of Special Operations Reconnaissance Doctrine included language about developed patience and intelligence through presence that would have seemed foreign to American special operations culture a generation prior. The document's authors did not cite British sources. They did not need to. General Stanley McChrystal, commanding JSOC from 2003 to 2008 and subsequently ISAF forces in Afghanistan, provided the closest approximation of formal acknowledgement in his 2013 memoir. Writing about coalition special operations, he noted that the British brought something we had to relearn, something our technology had taught us to forget. The men who were once banned from NATO exercises for refusing to follow American procedures had not changed their methods. American doctrine had moved toward them, absorbing lessons that dated to North Africa in 1941 and extended through every conflict since. The compass had not defeated the cosmos because compasses were superior instruments. It had prevailed because the men who trusted compasses understood something about warfare that satellites could not photograph and drones could not transmit. The uncomfortable truth was finally institutional policy, though the language of official doctrine would never admit the uncomfortable truth directly. It would simply incorporate what the British had always known and present it as innovation. This is perhaps the only acknowledgement that institutions are capable of providing. The quiet adoption of methods they once dismissed, the incorporation of philosophy they once banned. Captain Holloway's words from Kandahar remain the more honest assessment, spoken before doctrine caught up with reality. I felt like a child next to them. The statement is not self-deprecation. It is recognition. The recognition of a professional soldier encountering others who had simply been doing this longer, under harder conditions, with less technological comfort, and emerging from that crucible with something that cannot be requisitioned or manufactured. The SAS did not teach the Americans to abandon technology. They taught them to remember what technology was supposed to serve: the human with training, a rucksack, and an uncomfortable number of years on his shoulders, the man who has truly grown up.